to donating to Ukrainian aid orgs instead of honorariums today. And so that being said, we are going to get started. Before we get into some questions, our panelists have a lot of different backgrounds and are across the world today. So we were hoping that the panelists could do a quick introduction and a little bit of background. So who you are, what you do, where you are in the world right now, and your connection to science diplomacy, and specifically how it relates to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So whoever wants to start, feel free to just unmute and go ahead. Thanks, Sam.
Sure. Good morning, you guys. My name is Sam Anderson. It's great to see people across the world joining today. I was one of the first co-presidents of CASP, so it's really nice to be invited back to have a discussion today. Currently, I'm an American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellow, which is a mouthful. I'm currently located in Washington, D.C., and my fellowship placement is at the Department of State, the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Fund. I have to start today by saying that all views I express today are entirely my own. They do not reflect the view of the Department of State or the U.S. government in any way. Previously, I was a graduate student at UW-Madison in the biochemistry program. I studied hydrogen bonding and membrane proteins using high-throughput statistical analyses. After I graduated, I worked on the Hill with Representatives Deb Haaland and Gregory Meeks, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the time. And I've been interested in science diplomacy for quite a while, since when I started graduate school. When you start, you kind of get exposure to a lot of the international community through international collaborations, working with immigrant scientists, and the importance of scientific exchange during international conferences and trainings. One of my first exposures to science diplomacy was at the São Paulo School of Advanced Science on Science Diplomacy and Innovation Diplomacy in 2019. In this activity, scientists, lawyers, and policymakers from across the globe came together to write a mission statement for science diplomacy for the state of São Paulo in Brazil. It was a wonderful experience where I learned from the perspective of scientists and less resourced communities, and considered how the values of other cultures influence the way we practice science and science policy. Now, as a STPF fellow, one of the main components of my portfolio is managing the donation of chemical, biological, or radiological and nuclear, or other CBRN, response and readiness assistance for Ukraine. I'll dig more into that as we go on throughout, but I also cover biological threat reduction programming and the convergence of AI and national security. So with that, I'll turn it over to perhaps Professor Ted Gerber for introductions.
Thanks a lot. So my name is Ted Gerber. I'm a professor of sociology. I'm in Madison. I'm at UW. I've been here for 20 years. For most of my career, I've conducted sociological research and demographic studies of former Soviet countries, primarily Russia, but also other former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia. So I actually wrote my Ph.D. thesis in the early 1990s about the role of scientists, natural scientists, in the Soviet system, and the Soviet science institutions, and how those affected how scientists who were part of that system viewed the world, viewed scientific collaboration, themes like that. And then in the 2000s, I was involved in a series of evaluation studies looking at the effectiveness of some of the programs that the U.S. State Department, and along with other countries, implemented in order to provide assistance to scientists in Russia, Ukraine, other former Soviet countries in the 1990s, when after the Soviet collapse, the science system experienced a tremendous crisis, and there was a lot of concern on the part of Western governments that scientists who had been trained with skills that could be used by terrorists or by pariah states to conduct, to form weapons of mass destruction, to create weapons of mass destruction, would be tempted to go on the market because they were losing their salaries. So there was a huge outpouring of of donations and programs designed to divert, so to speak, former weapons scientists from the Soviet countries from such activities to convert them into doing civilian research projects. So I did a number of studies with some colleagues evaluating those programs, became familiar with them. I've also directed for many years here, although I'm not currently directing at the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia on campus. And also, when the war started, I was asked to head a task force by the Dean of International Studies here to assess the impact of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia on campus, for the UW community. And so I've also run a program called the Wisconsin Russia Project, which has been focused on encouraging more collaboration and academic exchanges between social scientists based in the United States and in Russia. So I've come at this from a variety of perspectives, but quite different from those of you on the call who are have a natural science background. I'm a social scientist. Thanks.
Okay, if it's my turn to have a brief introduction, my name is Georgi Sokolsky. I'm from Ukraine. I'm very happy to see here maybe my son, who is a member of your scientific community from this university. And as to me, let me say a few words. Maybe my English is not so fluent, so let me apologize for it. And I'm acting head of department now in KPI, so it's Kyiv Polytechnical Institute that bears the name Igor Sikorsky. You know, it's a famous person in USA, but he graduated our university before revolution, and more than 1,000 years ago. And you see that our country, Kyiv, is the capital of Ukraine, and our university is situated in Ukraine, in Kyiv. So I am a chemist that have more than 20 years of career in universities of our country, different universities of our country. What is most interesting, I think, as to my biography is that I was born during the USSR, you know, Soviet times, and my childhood was during these Soviet times. I was the witness of the beginning of independence of Ukraine, and some economical depression that correspond to the first years of independence, first decade of independence, and the gradual development of our country. And, you know, our way to the independence continues, and we have constant discussion in our society what it must be, our independence, what should we do. It's always continuous discussion. And you know that our neighboring country is not so democratic, and it helps us to fail our efforts with independence. So as to me, I'm a witness of this process, and as to me, as to science diplomacy, it's again as a function of these events. So my first attempts in science after graduation of university in 1995, 94, were and maybe my study in university were not close to science diplomacy or some international contacts, because we were concentrated upon some internal contacts with scientists in the Soviet Union and so on. So it was not possible. But as we know, as we see, the world is open, and after maybe 1 or 2 decades, these opportunities to find collaborators, find colleagues abroad were opened, and we gradually open our eyes and work with many colleagues abroad. And now it's typical situation inside our university, and it's a typical situation in our country. So my field of study is close to functional materials like oxide of transition metals in catalysis, electrocatalysis, photocatalysis, and we have some contacts with groups of different countries, and we conduct some mutual researches. And I think that some opportunities for science diplomacy appear here, and it's my maybe not so strong or experience, but maybe the beginning of this experience in science diplomacy, because it's always some exchange of information and some experience between us. So maybe that's all. If something will be necessary to explain, I will explain later. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for the wonderful introductions. So now kind of just to start things off. So science diplomacy is sort of the topic that that one of the CAS committees is focusing on this year. And there's a lot of like different definitions. I guess AAAS talks about science as a means of informing diplomacy, as well as science as a means of facilitating diplomacy, and diplomacy as a means of facilitating science. So that's all kind of wrapped up in this definition. So we were wondering if you all could sort of give your own definitions of science diplomacy and how science policy fits into diplomacy broadly. Yeah. Professor Gerber, I'll call on you to go first.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I think all of those components of science, those three components, are all important. They all represent distinctive challenges in the sense that I think it's, you know, we've seen in the current condition of the modern world that it's very hard to you know, to promote the goals of science and the international collaborations that are central to the flourishing of science. And it's also, you know, I would say of the three, the most daunting task of all is the goal of getting policymakers, politicians, leaders to actually use science and to deploy science in sort of a detached manner in order to formulate both foreign and domestic policies. I mean, I think there's a huge tendency for politicians everywhere to sort of pick and choose and cherry pick scientific findings that are convenient and suitable for them in the pursuit of their particular goals and interests. While at the same time, many leaders, particularly of large militarily powerful countries, they see science primarily as a tool for bolstering national security. So there's a strong tendency for politicians, I would say, to view science more as something that they wish to use as a tool, as opposed to something that they consult in order to formulate policies. Secondly, there's been a tremendous effort for scientific diplomacy, tremendous efforts to encourage more cooperation, for example, between Russian and US scientists, between Russian and or Chinese, perhaps, and American scientists. You know, scientists have, I think it's safe to say that scientists, you know, sort of intrinsically want to collaborate internationally. The scientists see their role, see science as international, not as bounded by national borders. They see their work as having universal applications, and they want to establish those types of connections to create an international scientific international scientific disciplines in which their work can be evaluated. And this, you know, this is, of course, is an intrinsic goal of scientific practice, internationalization, collaborations. but it often runs afoul of the objectives and of geopolitical relationships, where you have powerful governments who don't really necessarily adhere to the norms of science. In fact, to find them kind of threatening, because many governments are generally more interested in their own self-interest as a nation, or even their own self-interest as politicians. And so it will always be a struggle in terms of science diplomacy for scientists to have to articulate again and again and again the types of values and norms that drive them to seek cooperation with various governments, to seek support from various governments in their efforts to internationalize, to promote the values of science rather than the values of narrow political interest or national interest even. And I think we're in a very difficult moment right now, not only, but in part because of geopolitics, because of both Russia's war against Ukraine, but also because of the conflict, for example, between the United States and China, which poses a lot of issues in terms of scientific collaboration. And also in general, the sort of, we see the rise of populist movements in the United States, in Europe, in many countries, where part of the idea is a whole rejection of the notion of science and scientific elites and scientific knowledge. And we see in the many different reactions, for example, to the COVID-19 pandemic, that we shouldn't complacently assume that there's widespread public support or even endorsement or even acceptance of science as a sort of authority, that we see a lot of very widespread and powerful movements that seem to reject the notion that science has something to say and something useful to offer. And so I think I'm afraid that, and so I know this is covering a lot of territory. You asked specifically about scientific diplomacy, but I think this is all related, because I think really we find ourselves in 2023 in perhaps the most challenging moment, perhaps since the Second World War, in terms of the challenges that science diplomacy in all three of those senses that you described, Isabella, in all three of those senses, we really have a lot of work to do, and I'm afraid it's not a very encouraging situation right now. So thanks.
That was so interesting. Thank you so much.
I went a little different direction with my answer to this question, and talking about the definitions of science diplomacy and what that really looks like in the real world as you're practicing it, right? And so I wanted to talk about one of the projects I have, which is not Ukraine, but it's in biothreat reduction. And so it really falls in the diplomacy for science category, right? Diplomacy can facilitate international scientific cooperation. And so in my office, one of the projects I'm working on is to generate an international biosafety research agenda. So there's a bunch of gaps in biosafety where we do a practice because we think it's safe, but there's not necessarily scientific backing behind that practice. And the idea for this project came from a former IPRIBer that also works at the State Department with me. So there's a lot of Wisconsin at the State Department, which is an interesting choice. And so first, we were bringing together scientists from across the globe to identify gaps in this research space. And then once the agenda is fully informed by the scientific community, we're going to present it to the international community to work together to try to fill those gaps. And so this is the diplomacy for science. But if you look at it in another light, it could also be science in diplomacy if there's an international policy or agreement that implements new research. Or it could be science for diplomacy if by attending these workshops, the scientists go back home with better connections to scientists from other countries and facilitate continued collaboration. So these definitions are nice academic thoughts, but in practice, it really all melds together. Thanks.
It's my turn. Let me add my comments about these definitions. My opinion is that they are always that all these definitions work together to formulate general idea because they represent different sides of the same phenomena. As to me, at the beginning, I suppose that science in diplomacy it's most correct for this notion science diplomacy because it's something neutral that can help to maybe maybe solve problems of different levels in our society and higher, because science has no limits and we can solve by using scientific methods any problem, as we know. As to the next definition, science in diplomacy, I agree that in this case we agree with the previous information of Sam that it's like a gap that can be filled using this approach. Because science has their own methods, and sometimes we need some improvements and so on. And in this case, such an approach can be useful. As to science for diplomacy, I think that it's a movement from the maybe beginning from the lowest level, from ordinary scientists to the up to the government, up to the more common groups of people. And I think that right now we observe many initiatives from people throughout the world related to our war, related to Ukraine, and we feel constant support of our scientists, of our people from scientists or researchers throughout the world. We know many initiatives, we know many funding grants and so on that proposed for our people now to support them in this difficult situation. We know that many Ukrainians are now abroad, and they really have very important support, and mostly they have propositions from research groups of many universities or other organizations abroad. I think it's like science for diplomacy, because really every researcher, scientist, or any researcher and scientist abroad of our country has initiative to can have this initiative and express this initiative to help our citizens, and we really feel this support. It's my opinion. Thank you.
So interesting. Thank you all. Those were really cool answers. Okay, so kind of moving, what connection do you see? And I think a lot of you sort of answered this already, but feel free to elaborate or take a different angle if you want. So what connections do you see between science diplomacy efforts and how that changes, both specifically with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as generally to any war?
Well, I'll jump in to start with here too. So there are of course many different connections. So from one perspective, the war could be seen as a sign of the failure of science and science diplomacy that has been conducted over the last roughly 30 years on the part of many well-meaning institutions and individuals to use science as a way to bring Russia. I mean, let's face it, we're talking about Russia. It's Russia who attacked Ukraine. That's absolutely clear. There's no ambiguity there. And so many efforts were directed. The sort of model was that through enhanced scientific collaboration, by providing Western support for the development of Russian science on the basis of Soviet science capacity. I mean, most of Soviet scientific institutes, not all, but many of them were concentrated in Russia, and they suffered a huge crisis after the Soviet collapse. And the idea was that by forging scientific cooperation and collaboration, that would help to modernize Russia socially, politically, economically. It would help bring Russia into the fold of cooperative Western countries. And so in one sense, and having personally participated in such programs myself in many different guises, I mean, I've been involved in programs to help train Ukrainian and Russian economists, for example, things like that. it really was kind of a deeply upsetting sense that the war provoked, that all these efforts were for nothing, because, billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of people were involved in trying to use scientific collaboration as one way to bridge the long gap, the serious gap that has existed between Russia and the United States and NATO countries and the EU and so forth. And so there's a profound sense of failure. And of course, you can't really say that that scientific diplomacy by itself was going to address the various problems in Russian-U.S. relations. And so it's not really fair to lay it all on science, but honestly, the sense that really what was achieved as a result of all those efforts, all those attempts. So that's sort of the really grim, pessimistic outlook and so other things. So for one thing, what the war has brought home is that so we need to learn from our mistakes. What have we done wrong? What can we do better? And for one, the war has really brought home how the sort of overwhelming focus on Russia, as opposed to the other former Soviet countries. I mean, there were programs in Ukraine as well. There are programs in places like Armenia, Azerbaijan, but the overwhelming focus on Russia was perhaps misplaced, and that we should have collectively done more to try to establish stronger ties between Western scientists and Ukrainian scientists. Now, as Professor Sokolsky mentioned, a lot of that is starting to happen now, and it's a great sign that I think that there is now tremendous goodwill, tremendous interest, both on the part of governments, but also on the part of individual scientists, on the part of universities, to do what can be done to help Ukrainian scientists and to help, and I'm sure when the war ends, that there's going to be a tremendous commitment of resources and efforts to try to help rebuild the destruction that the war had, to rebuild Ukrainian scientific infrastructure. And so, I don't want to dwell too much on the past because the past is done. We can't change that now. But what we can do is really redouble our commitment to investing in the reconstruction of Ukrainian science, and that involves many different efforts. I'm sure we'll talk about that more as the panel evolves. But right now, under conditions of war, the war continues, and it's impossible for Ukrainian men age 18 to 60 to even leave the country. Women can leave the country, so we can certainly create positions and opportunities for women scientists from Ukraine, but for the men scientists, we have to figure out ways to get the resources to them while they're still in Ukraine. And so many universities are a little reluctant to invest in activities that don't happen, that don't directly benefit the university. But that has to change. It is changing. There are some efforts underway. So I would say overall, the war has provoked a sense of deep, profound disappointment in terms of the all of those efforts now. That took place. MIT had this big investment in Skolkovo, in this sort of scientific research park endeavor in Moscow, which it had to pull out of. Also within Russia, and this is the final thing I'll say. Within Russia, it's really in my area, in social sciences like economics and political science and sociology, you do see on the one hand an impressive growth of the capacity within Russia and also within Ukraine, but particularly in Russia, because Russia did invest a lot in its universities starting in the 2000s. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there wasn't much by way of economics and political science and sociology in Russia. And the Soviet ideology sort of viewed those as bourgeois disciplines and wouldn't allow them to develop. But in a rapid period of time, you did see the emergence of a rather strong capacity, international capacity in terms of measured by international publications and things like that in those fields. And that is also, it saddens me to say, really jeopardized by the war, that the Putin government has really cracked down on universities, has brought them to heel, is undertaking an thorough militarization of Russian society, and that includes, it's probably not the first and foremost aspect of the Russian domestic policy in the last 5 years, even before the war, but it does include a real crackdown on academic freedom and tremendous restrictions on the ability of social scientists to do their work within Russia. And even we've seen arrests of natural scientists under sort of charges of espionage and treason. So right now, Russian universities are also really being destroyed by this war, or as a corollary of this war, as a sort of collateral damage. And so also many Russian scientists themselves are very much against the war. Many social scientists in particular are involved in oppositional activities. A lot of them have had to flee the country because they fear that they will be imprisoned, and many of them have been imprisoned. And so they're also, I mean, their suffering doesn't compare to the experiences of Ukrainian scientists whose universities are being attacked, who are losing their lives, but Russian scientists as well, many of them have also suffered. And so that's another thing we should keep in mind, that while we really should prioritize assisting Ukrainian scientists, we should also provide perhaps some support for Russian scientists, on the condition that they oppose the government. I don't think we should be now supporting Russian scientists who support their government in their war, but there are many who don't fall in that category. And so I think the tasks are monumental. What we as Americans, as Westerners, as people who are concerned about the well-being of science above and beyond, who are also, want to see Ukraine rebuilt successfully after the war concludes, and maybe in the longer term, I'm not naive, but maybe also foresee perhaps a better future for Russia than is entailed with, or that departs from the trajectory that that country has had in the last 20 years. Science has a great and multifaceted role to play in all those efforts. It's going to be costly. It's going to require a lot of devotion of both our resources, but also our brain power in terms of coming up with solutions to these many different challenges moving forward.
Thank you so much.
Okay, it's my turn, and let me formulate my attitude to this problem. As to science diplomacy and Russian invasion of Ukraine, so we should consider 3 points. First of all, what are the science diplomacy related to both countries, and what is the situation with science diplomacy in both countries too. I think that first of all, we should consider really in history, in development, this issue. For instance, I remember my experience of contacts, sorry please, contacts with Russia, and for instance, my last visit in Russia was in 2013, when my colleagues answered to my questions about possible collaboration, that any contacts with Ukrainian scientists are forbidden. They informed me that that's all. So we cannot contact because some people forbid us to make any contact with the Ukrainian scientists. So it was shock for me, shock for them too. But it was 1 year before beginning of the aggression, and you see that it was quite expected that from the point of view of the future events. Let me add that in Ukraine, the science diplomacy about Ukraine. So first of all, we had very, I think Ukraine was always one in the avant-garde, or at the top of efforts of Soviet Union in science, because we have very powerful sector of research organization, for instance, academician institutes that were in some issues, in some fields of study, were prominent, were the best in the former Soviet Union. We had many organizations, many industrial productions that were defined the progress of Soviet Union in general. You know, even the same rockets that we have now that attack us, some of them, the technologies were developed in Ukraine. So in our case, we have really the gap between our current state and former state, and you know that we had a very difficult period when we were alone with our maybe without any science diplomacy, you know, without any support, I think, because nobody could prevent or predict what happens and what to do. Yeah, and we really decided independently. It was decision of our people of Ukrainian former Soviet Republic, because it was not election, but referendum about our freedom, and all citizens, the predominant number voted that they want to be independent, not any, so without any former or any form of Soviet Union. We know this. But after that, we were alone, mostly so close to 1 decade, I think, with our economical and other problems. But after all, we started more or less stable life. And in this case, we have many opportunities that appeared, and let me name the program of Soros, you know, this philanthrope, okay, from the USA, who was one of the first people who persons who supported Ukrainian scientists, and I know many my colleagues who were supported, and they were very impressed by this support, because it was single possible support when we had very difficult situation, economical situation. After all, let me mention the European program of Erasmus Plus, because as to me, it's quite interesting and important experience for us to be inside of the very multinational society of Europe, and to have many contacts with scientists of European countries. And our university has many programs, many programs of Erasmus Plus, where not only students have academical exchange, but scientists too. Unfortunately, due to war, we have no such active exchange now, but really Erasmus Plus, other programs of Europe help us to be more close to our colleagues abroad, and to know, to be, to have new experience, to exchange by our achievements. I think that as to science diplomacy, let me mention the fact about letters of scientists against war. For instance, in Russia, I know some scientists, I know some scientists that were who signed this letter, and as you know, many of them are in prison now, or can be in prison, or now have to move from the country, but they express their experience, their opinion, and it was like science diplomacy, and it's example when it does not work in totalitarian countries where democracy does not work. So in our case, for instance, my first reaction when war started was to inform my colleagues. I wrote some letters and used some social media to inform them about our situation, and they in turn support me, and we try to together to propose some decisions. For instance, some of our colleagues from universities in Kharkiv were under constant attacks, and we tried to find for them a place to be evacuated from Kharkiv. And it's interesting to note that our foreign colleagues from France found grants, found financial opportunities, but our professor from Kharkiv University decided not to move because he wanted to be to the end at his job, at his faculty, at his department, and he decided not to move. It was very impressive for me in the difficult situation of constant attacks every day. So it's one of examples. So I really think that science diplomacy works from the lowest level at first. I see many examples, but if we have any other attempts from maybe the top maybe institutions or governments and so on, in this case, not all efforts work, because we have to, first of all, Russia with the absence of any other normal or ordinary approach to any contacts from the point of any view. So science diplomacy or science diplomacy. So in any case, any approaches don't work, because really it's aggression that we have against us, and that's all that we see. And any other things, I think, don't work. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and then Sam.
Yeah, there's 2 points I want to make on the idea of science diplomacy and wars. And the first is that diplomacy does not stop just because a war has started, right? A lot of diplomatic ties are often cut. But one specific example that I've paid a lot of attention to is that is the work of the International Atomic Energy Association. So it was a tremendous amount of effort and a success for the IAEA to be able to access the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia power plant in Ukraine during active conflict in and around the area, to do safety inspections on the nuclear plant, to assess whatever damage was done from the shelling in the area. Ukraine is intimately familiar with the results of nuclear accidents. And so during this time, both the Russians and the Ukrainians had to ensure that the IAEA and their personnel would have safe passage through an active war zone and full access to the plant and the personnel at the time. As a key power plant in the region, Zaporizhzhia remains a strategic resource that both sides want to control, and the IAEA and their presence in the area absolutely affects what happens in the war in the area. The other point I want to make is that diplomacy has both carrots and sticks, right? So both Dr. Gerber and Dr. Sokolsky, talked about Russian scientists protesting their war, various interactions they've had with scientists in Russia. And when the war broke out, I was serving on the political action committee of the Biophysical Society. And there were a lot of discussions within many scientific societies about whether or not they should expel Russian scientists from membership for the course of the war. Whether to penalize individuals for their country's actions is a moral quandary that was not and should not ever be taken lightly. Most societies, I think, landed on the side of not expelling, but not initiating any new connections. But it's certainly a contentious question. And it's not as easy, I think, to distinguish which Russian scientists are working for the Russian government of their own free will. And so I think that's a really important point to consider, and whether what their actions are reflect not necessarily their own desires. Over. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So just to give the audience a warning, so we're hoping to switch over to audience questions around 10-ish. So feel free, you're welcome to start throwing them in the chat if you have questions. But before we get to that, We are gonna skip down our list for our panelists because there's one question we really wanted to get to. So this is a question that focuses on nuclear non-proliferation. So in the 1990s, Ukraine gave up former USSR nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances under the Budapest Memorandum. And so then the question is, how has the Russian invasion of Ukraine affected your views on nuclear non-proliferation? And do you see this as an effective strategy for promoting peace?
So I want to jump in first because the NDF, my office, was founded in 1994 under the Freedom Support Act to stop the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, missiles, and advanced or destabilizing conventional weapons. And one of the first accomplishments of my office was the dismantlement and destruction of former Soviet Union's weapons of mass destruction. Exactly this thing the question is talking about. In tandem, the office aimed, what Dr. Gerber referred to earlier, aimed to ensure that scientific expertise in these fields were not used for nefarious purposes. In other words, they ensured that nuclear experts did not have the incentive or materials that could assist them in making new nuclear weapons in the new states that were former Soviet Union. Despite Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, because I just want to re-mention that in 2014 they invaded, I still think nuclear non-proliferation is an effective strategy for world peace. I don't think that this invasion has changed my mind on that. Stopping the spread of nuclear weapons worldwide makes everyone safer as an overall world. And adding nuclear weapons to this current war, which I hope and I have strong hopes that will not happen on the Russian side. But adding it to the current war would only increase the casualties, the environmental tragedies, the overall damage of this crisis to the region. And so I continue to believe that, you know, preventing the spread, reducing stockpiles is an admirable goal that we should all really strive to. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam.
Okay, if it's my turn to express my opinion, let me add the following, that I remember well the times when Budapest Memorandum was signed, and it was initiative of our country is the gesture of free free action from us, and you see that it was like decision between several countries when these countries give us some safety again, so in exchange with this nuclear weapon, you know. But as we see that this memorandum did not work at all, I think that existence of such memorandum, so nuclear weapon in Ukraine now, in some degree, can be useful, could be useful, but you know that. In case of countries like Russia with such leaders like Putin, I think they had these plans, they will have or simply have these plans in any way, in any case. It will not depend on nuclear weapon or not. Because you see the situation when any logical explanation of what happens now can be applied to our situation. And I think that it will not help. But maybe I agree that such aggression in these forms that we have now maybe will not be possible or cannot be like we have. But generally, my idea that Ukraine, like any progressive countries, must be in structures like NATO, like European Union. In this case, it's better protection against such a situation that we describe, such wars that we describe, because in this case, I think it works better. It works better. Thank you. It's only my opinion about this.
Just briefly, I really want to second Professor Sokolsky's concluding thoughts there. I think, yes, on the one hand, certainly from the Ukrainians' perspective, many of them feel that had the country not relinquished its nuclear weapons after the Soviet collapse, then that would have deterred Putin and Russia from attacking now. And perhaps that's true. We'll never really know. But I don't think that the logical conclusion from that is that we should abandon non-proliferation as a goal, or we should start to encourage small countries or weaker countries to develop nuclear weapons. I think quite the opposite. I think the key to security is to participate in alliances and to form, military alliances, not just economic unions like the EU, but NATO. And I think that's also the key to Ukraine's security moving forward. And so I think that's where our diplomatic effort should focus. I think non-proliferation should remain an important goal of those who want a world peace and who want a peaceful coexistence among nations. I think if you look at the countries that are actively seeking to develop nuclear weapons today, such as Iran, such as North Korea, well, I mean, those are not countries that are seeking to develop weapons for, only for the purposes of defense. And in fact, it's no accident that those are two of Russia's very few remaining allies today. The problem with nuclear weapons is a problem that Russia and Russia's actions and Russia's policies have really brought to the fore. While Russia has crossed a threshold in this war, it hasn't yet used nuclear weapons, but the extent to which it's openly threatened to do so, where you have powerful, influential Russian commentators such as Sergei Karaganov, openly writing articles saying that the time has come for Russia to use nuclear attacks. I mean, it's Russia that has stepped over the bounds of what's acceptable. And I'm afraid, the solution is to defeat Russia and to end its war efforts and to try to get it to change its behavior. It's not to encourage proliferation of nuclear weapons to other countries, because the possible consequences of other governments and other countries having nuclear weapons, the risks far outweigh any deterrent benefit that it might have. And so I completely agree that although it's very unfortunate from the Ukrainian perspective, and I'm sympathetic with their view of many Ukrainians I speak to, that they should not have relinquished their nuclear weapons, it doesn't follow from that we should drop the goal of non-proliferation. So I'm glad that the office that Sam works in and many forces in the U.S. government and internationally are still seeing nuclear non-proliferation as an important goal for the protection of world peace.
Thank you all so much. We have a ton more questions, but I do want to make sure we give audience members an opportunity to ask. So if any audience members have a question, feel free to unmute and ask, or if you want to put it in the chat, I'm happy to read them. Give a sec. Okay, well, then I'll just ask another question, and as they come up, everyone's welcome to put them in the chat. So this next question is about sharing research. So for those of you that are involved in research, how is it used and shared across international borders? And how do you approach the issue of should this ever be withheld? Should research and information ever be withheld?
I want to start by saying you guys came up with an amazing list of questions. I really enjoyed reading through them and talking through them with colleagues about what a good answer is. And this is obviously a question that has entered the public realm in a lot of different ways. And NSPN, actually, for the professors, the National Science Policy Network, of which CASP is a chapter, held a book club a few years ago on the book Freedom's Laboratory, The Cold War Struggle for the Soul of Science. And there's a lot of really interesting case studies in that book about this exact question. And so when I was in graduate school, as a big proponent of open science and the free flow of information across borders, I did, and I still do, strongly believe in the value of diverse thought in advancing the scientific endeavor and in exchange overall. In my opinion, the free and open exchange of scientific ideas leads to the most rapid scientific development. However, achieving the most progress at the greatest speed is only one goal among many, and it must be weighed against other important values. And if you're looking at it from a national perspective, other geopolitical considerations. Some things that I didn't consider when I was in graduate school that have now come into my mind as I've been working in national security for a few years now is when you're trying to determine how open you should be with individuals or institutions or as societies, you kind of have to consider the safety of the research, what's in there that could or could not be dangerous, who benefits the most from you being open. Can the science be weaponized at any point? Do the people you want to share with also value free and open exchange? I think there are reasons to withhold scientific research or advancements in certain contexts, especially when they pertain to dangerous technologies, and perhaps when they involve actors who do not have as much freedom of thought as the United States does. Thanks.
Really interesting. Thanks, Sam. Professor Sokolsky, do you want to?
Okay, I'll try to answer this question. As to me, I remember times when I was young student, when we have many barriers to know about current science abroad. We have huge success in classical approaches to science, to chemistry and so on, but sometimes it was a gap between current situation in science and our understanding of progress of science abroad. Really, we had many barriers. So not we, but Soviet science and so on. And I really remember similar effects. But you know, one of the reasons of such barriers were our state with the struggle between two states, between two different approaches, but at first, I think later, after all, the language was the reason of such barrier. Many scientists suppose that in their understanding of science is enough for any the activity, but let me note that use of English language now is an instrument for such exchange, for such activity across the borders, because when you cannot use, for instance, English language, you are limited in your attempts, you are limited in your progress with exchange of your ideas and so on. And at the beginning, it was very difficult for us, for scientists who started the activity, for instance, at the beginning of independence. We firstly, as to me, it was tasked to know better English language for these contacts, for this activity. And now, really, we have more opportunities, and we have no question about language, but we should simply choose the opportunities, and any of us can be abroad can find colleagues, can find opportunities for collaboration. So it's ordinary things now, and for instance, I have some contacts using Erasmus Plus projects with some research groups from Italy, for instance, from Poland, and we have contacts during conferences. I think that really science cannot be with borders, and science does not depend on borders, and it's good for us that we have common attitude to science as something without borders, and we should simply work for its progress. And in our case, conferences, it's a chance to have such exchange, to share ideas. And I think that, for instance, conference where representatives of many countries, many cultures can have this exchange, or it can be visit abroad using some programs. So I think that it's very important part of activity of scientists, of researcher, and very beautiful for us that these opportunities work and we can use them. Thank you.
So I would just like to add 2 points to the very helpful comments of my two co-panelists. And that is so first of all, I just want to note that the political borders and political restrictions are not the only form of limitation on scientific communication. We also have to consider the role that commercial interests have, and so much scientific research is funded by private corporations, which then hold the intellectual property rights to a lot of what is produced. And so that's of course that sort of logic, I mean, it's understandable from one perspective, but it also does go against the sort of universalism of science and the desire on the part of many scientists to have their work spread. So there has to be a balance struck between the interests of those who are funding the research to make a profit from it, but also for those who are actually doing the research themselves to be able to share the results with broader communities. So, and then secondly, and this probably has more to do with the area of my own work, which is social science. And I know that not everybody thinks of social science as necessarily science, but economics, political science, there's usually less of a sort of security aspect of that. But I do think that in the current world, that social scientists are under a lot of what I would call sort of political pressures on the part of various groups, and they range across the whole political spectrum, many of whom often don't like whatever sort of findings or research results are produced. And so I'm very concerned, particularly because it affects my own work and that of my colleagues directly, that form of restrictions on scientific results, where certain topics are considered to be completely unacceptable for political reasons. You're supposed to not even ask certain questions. I think, and again, I think that this comes both from the political left and from the political right. So it's not like there's just one sort of source of efforts to restrict social science inquiry on those kinds of grounds. And I think that also relates to the current war quite directly, in the sense that many people have spent a lot of time studying say Russian politics, and so many of them are now under a lot of criticism for having failed to have anticipated the war, or having done research that sort of normalizes the nature of the Putin regime to treat it as if it's some kind of interesting form of authoritarianism, and that sort of detached approach is very upsetting to some people who feel that political science in particular, but social science in general, and commentators should have done a better job anticipating this war, explaining to U.S. and European governments the dangers represented by Putin's aggression. And so, that's a very fair criticism to make. I'm not saying that criticism should not be made, but what does concern me is that one does hear occasionally, some kind of statements along the lines of like, well, why do we even study Russia anymore? It's just a pariah state. It's just a terrible dictatorship. It's a society of, fascists who just want to destroy everything. And while I may or may not agree with those characterizations of Russian government, Russian society, I do think it's important for us to remember that as scientists, our goal is to try to understand first and foremost, to try to understand the world, and then we can reach judgments about it. Then we can, or we can let others do that. We can engage in conversations. But I think in the social sciences right now, it's a somewhat challenging moment, and because wars, they force everybody to try to take sides, and it's very natural. It's a very human response to want to do so. But as scientists, as social scientists, we need to try to detach from our views about the ethics and the norms and what's right and wrong about what Russia is doing. And I think there's not much disagreement about that. But we have to try to be detached and objective in terms of our methodological approaches, our theories. And so I worry about that aspect of the impact of the war on scientific practice in the social sciences.
Thank you all so much. So I'm just going to keep going because we have a lot more questions. So one of the other effects we've seen as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the migration of people, including scientists and research, into Poland, as well as other countries. So what are the effects that you have witnessed of war on the migration of people?
Well, I'll start up here because it's something that I've studied myself. And so, yes, I mean, there's some, by most estimates, at least 7 million Ukrainian refugees have left Ukraine, and the number continues to grow. There's also mass displacement within Ukraine. Many people have lost their homes or are fleeing the conflict, have lost their jobs. And it, of course, first and foremost, one thinks of the humanitarian dimension. One of the things that has impressed me about this, I mean, there's wars all the time. I mean, I don't want to say all the time, but there's often, huge conflicts that lead to huge refugee flows. Most refugee flows actually occur in what we call South-South. So most refugee situations involve countries in the so-called global South, poor countries, which have weak states and have failed states and have very poor economies who suffer economic crises. And most of the refugees go to neighboring countries, which are also, similarly poor. The Western countries have become quite skilled at, although they've signed the UN Convention on Refugees, and so they're committed, they're legally obliged through international law to provide asylum for those refugees who are seeking political asylum. They have ways of preventing them from ever setting foot on the territories of the Western countries. So what's really striking about this from a sort of comparative refugee studies perspective is precisely how much support and how welcoming the European Union countries in particular, but not just them, also countries like well, say for example, Israel, or like Moldova, another former Soviet country that's not part of the EU, which has had a huge flow of refugees from Ukraine. But the overwhelming impression I have is that, yes, of course, there's some objections. Yes, of course, there are problems. Yes, of course, there are difficulties. But the amount of support that the European Union and, the assistance from the UNHCR and from other entities, and also just on the level of societies. I mean, I've traveled to these countries in recent months. In Germany, Moldova, Estonia, another very small country which is on a per capita basis, perhaps hosts more Ukrainian refugees than anyone. And the level of public support is what's really striking. That in most cases you see people who are very reluctant to take on refugees. They see them as a threat, a security risk, an economic threat. There was a huge flow of refugees from Syria not long ago, and European reactions were very different, very hostile, very unwilling. But what we see, one of the impressive things is that to me, what it says is that, yes, I mean, human societies can act in a humanitarian progressive fashion. We don't have too many good examples of positive responses, not only on the part of governments, but also on the part of societies, where you have people volunteering, people, giving up their time, giving up their resources, taking refugees into their homes. And so to me, it's actually been one of the, very few sort of silver linings of this war and this conflict, is that you see, human societies are sometimes capable of doing the right thing and extending a welcoming hand and doing what they can to support those who have been victimized through no fault of their own by the aggressive actions of a foreign government, and who are just trying to survive and to preserve themselves as a nation, to preserve themselves as a people. So I'm actually, one could always say, yes, more work could be done, we need more resources, but by and large, I think the European response in particular should get very high grades. It's fraught, there's political tensions that will continue to arise in countries like Poland and Germany over these issues, as the war continues, as the refugee issues persist. But I say overall, it's really a striking and encouraging case where which does sort of restore one's faith in the ability of human beings to reach out to strangers and to provide assistance to them.
Okay, maybe let me add my experience to the previous information, because really it's my own opinion and my own experience, and I was witness of the beginning of war when Russians were in the suburbs of Kyiv, and it was one experience when we heard many attacks, and it was even some military activity at the streets of Kyiv with shoots, with many effects that we can expect from this. But fortunately, this active period was only at the beginning, and when Russia moved from northern Ukraine, we have the next step of this aggression, and we have rocket attacks and drones attacks. And you see that every day our citizens have safety problems or are not safe due to these attacks, and we are not sure that next time this drone or this rocket will have influence or simply will explode near our house or in our house, because we really have many examples. But we are again lucky in Kyiv because we have good protection against rockets and against drones. And last summer we observed many attacks every night. Every night it's like some show for us. On the one hand, on the other hand, it's not a good idea to compare these effects with show, because when we observe some rockets, when some weapon try to prevent these attacks, so it's for us every day, it's our habit to observe these alarms, and namely at night and so on. But we are lucky again, because if we compare a situation with the eastern regions, where simply we had very developed industrial regions, we have many cities and so on. Right now we have only consequences of the war activity without any opportunities for life for people and so on. So you see that situation is quite different, and some cities and some Ukrainians had to move immediately. I'm very impressed by Kharkiv. This city is the example of struggle against Russia, because even in 2014 it was a chance for Russia to attack Kharkiv and to occupy Kharkiv, like Donetsk, like Lugansk. But I know the opinion of the citizens of these city, and they opinion that they are independent. They express this opinion and prevented any actions of Russians against their city. And you know that Kharkiv is Ukrainian city till this date. Currently, it's our city. Well, but it's a very difficult experience for citizens of this, inhabitants of the city now, because you know that the distance to the border of Ukraine is here close to 50 kilometers, and it means that you cannot expect, you don't know what happens in the next few minutes for you, because any moment you can expect some attack from any type of weapons that have Russians. And I'm very impressed by you. You remember my example with scientists from the Kharkiv Polytechnic Institute. We tried to find for him opportunities to abandon this very unsafe place, but he answered me that he want to be to the end with his city, with his university, with his department. You know that it's attitude of citizens of Kharkiv, and it's really attitude of many Ukrainians to the situation. But we have women, we have children, and you know that in this case, this experience for them is quite dangerous. And not safe, you know, and we have many problems that are now at the second plan, or are not so important comparing with the task to survive in this situation. And I agree that it's very important opportunity for them to move abroad, to be in safe place. And you know that millions of people from Ukraine moved to nearest countries, and mostly European countries. And let me express my gratitude to them for constant support, for many opportunities for our citizens, because really I know many examples of this good attitude and opportunities for our citizens. What can be added to this situation? Yes, and we have some regions that were occupied by Russians, and it's the other situation, because people sometimes had no chances to leave these places, and you know the problem with our children that were moved to Russia, that we cannot expect that Russians have any maybe know any rules or use any laws for these children, because you know sometimes they have parents, sometimes not, but contacts between these children and parents are very difficult, and sometimes we have many problems with this, and to solve this problem now is very difficult. I remember the information about 20,000 children that were moved to Russia from occupied regions during this aggression. They will inform you about some safety of children. They want to save them. But really, if you will see from the other side on this situation, it's not ordinary action to save children. No, it's the goal of this action is the other one. And I know many my colleagues, for instance, from Kherson, that had to be during had to state to be during occupation of Russians in the city, and really it was a very dangerous experience for them, because and now they really remained in Kherson despite all changes. because Kherson, it's a city at the southern part of Ukraine, close to Black Sea region, at the well, close to Crimea Peninsula, but really now it's very dangerous place due to the border with occupied territory, and the one side of Dnieper River is free against Russia, so we have no Russians here, and the left-hand side of Dnieper River is occupied by Russians, and so right-hand side it's Kherson, and we know that every day we have attacks by many weapons, and as I know, my colleague is here is in Kherson, and it's very difficult for us to have contacts because really it's very difficult to imagine how can they survive in this situation, but they live in these conditions. As to me, I really have some every day. Not every day now, but sometimes every day attacks from Russia, and we survive. Yes, but in Kherson, its situation by few orders of magnitude is more difficult. And in this case, they try to survive. In this case, I agree that the help from Western countries is very important, and some people could not live in conditions of everyday war, everyday dangerous conditions. And I think that, again, let me express gratitude for this position of many countries that save lives of our citizens. I remember a few days of these aggressions. Railway stations, they're full of people, and it's difficult to imagine. It's not the situation that you want to describe to anyone, but really these bridges, really our railway stations, our railways worked as such bridges for such movement of our women, of our children to abroad, across the border, and for instance in Poland and so on, and they worked well, and we were able to move many people in the short period of time to other regions of our country, because we, that our our western regions like Lviv, our Chernivtsi, Ivano-Frankivsk, and other cities of western regions are relatively safe. Not now, but mostly because you see that we have the next stage of this war when there are many drones, there are many rockets, and we cannot predict next step of this aggression. But these drones have no any localization, any borders. They can attack any city of our country. But relatively safe was Western regions, and we had many. Due to railway, we had opportunities to move many citizens from one side to the other side, and then some of them that wanted to move fast abroad through the borders, they move, and without any problems they do this. And let me again state that it was very important for us and very important support. Thank you.
All right, Sam.
I don't think I could follow that up. All I'll say is that our office is working on placements for virtual fellowships for Ukrainian scientists still in Ukraine. Those are going on, as well as in-person scientific placements in the US. So there are so many things I wanted to talk about brain drain and reintegration, but I cannot possibly follow up Georgi's statement there. So thank you, and thank you for your donation to the Ukrainian support.
Yeah, so we are hitting time. So again, reminder for those in Madison, we are having an event, a happy hour tonight at 5 p.m. at Steenbox. Feel free. There's a lot in this panel I want to talk to people about and think about. So I'm excited for that. And most importantly, if we can thank our 3 panelists, virtual round of applause. This was so interesting. I learned so much. And I think I speak for all of us that feel very lucky we got to do this. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, it's been a great pleasure to hear my fellow panelists.
And thank you too from me, because it's first experience of such participation in similar events. So let me wish good luck to your movement, to science diplomacy, because really I agree it's very important for us now, opportunity to make for us some positive things. And so thank you.